our next speaker has really made such an impact with their research, of which you're going to hear a little bit today. So it's my absolute pleasure to welcome to the stage Daniella Gati.
Imagine this scenario. You're a teenager, and you're a little bit nervous and a little bit uncertain, and you have a lot of questions. And the questions revolve around feeling different from the others. And it feels very unsafe to explore with others, because you're maybe wondering, perhaps you're queer. It feels unsafe to explore with your peers, at school, or in other places that you might explore. So instead, you go online on some kind of platform where you have an AI chatbot, like ChatGPT, to converse with, and you start asking these questions. You start asking questions about gender and sexuality, and the bot responds. Now, what do we know about that response? It is going to pretend that it knows the answer to everything, or pretend, or at least look like. It will know all about sexual orientation, identity, gender, everything about the acronym LGBTQ, even the plus. It will know everything. So the difference between you and the chatbot in this situation is quite stark. You are uncertain, you're nervous, you're anxious, you know so little and you have so many questions, and the bot looks oracular. It seems to know everything. So whatever the bot ends up saying, it's likely to have an influence on how you're going to start articulating your own identity, your own personality, and questions around your sexuality. In other words, it's going to have an impact on how we as humans form the knowledges that we have, and that knowledge itself is going to be potentially impacted by the AI. So this scenario is far from hypothetical, although I made it up in this particular case. A 2024 study by Common Sense Media, Hope Lab, and the Harvard Graduate School of Education Center for Digital Thriving found that about half of young people had already used generative AI in their lives. And in fact, of those people, about half of them used it first and foremost to get information. Now, that information was not restricted to finding out about historical facts or math or whatever, but rather it importantly revolved around intimate, emotional questions relating to the human experience. So for example, one of the participants said that AI helps me ask questions without feeling pressure. Another participant said, AI has already tapped into the sex market, and it has characters that are influencing people. My point is not to be alarmist, but rather to observe the fact that regardless of whether we're queer or not yet queer, or maybe never going to be queer, AI has a potential to influence the way that we understand ourselves, our identities, our gender, and our sexuality as well, even for intimate questions. So it becomes very important for us to understand how AI comes up with the knowledge that it gives back to us, and what kind of knowledge it creates. Now, in my research, I dissect AI algorithms, and what I do is I try to figure out how do they come up with that knowledge? What is their knowledge-making process? And what I find is that we can describe that process quite succinctly as a statistical knowledge-making process. Now, what does that mean? Essentially, what it means is that the algorithms comb through a vast trove of data, and as they do that, they try to distill that data into patterns. So they try to identify patterns. And then they use those patterns, in the case of generative AI, to create new output. Now, other types of AI do other stuff with those patterns. Don't want to talk about predictive AI here. I'm going to focus on generative AI. Generative AI uses those patterns to create output that looks new. That's why it's in quotation marks. It looks new, but it actually conforms to those patterns. So to give you an example from large language models, what large language models do, for example, is as they comb through the data, they might find patterns like that drag queens, for example, are frequently described with words like glamorous and fabulous. Another pattern that they might also find is that glamorous and fabulous frequently stand in the similar or same positions in language in sentences as words like gorgeous and stunning. So now the large language model might use these two patterns, put them together, and come up with new output that looks something like this. These drag queens are gorgeous. But now let's pause for a second and just consider for a moment that the data that these models use to train their algorithms to come up with those patterns, that data is essentially all of the internet. And if you think for a moment about what we know about the internet, what kind of place the internet is, what other patterns do you think are likely that these algorithms might come up with? Yeah, so we've got a bit of a problem here. These models have a tendency to produce hate speech, or at least offensive language, language that's going to be problematic. Now, tech developers are going to be the first to tell you, yes, this is a major problem, so we started working on it, and we worked a lot on it and came up with a lot of advanced fine-tuning methods, and these methods have allowed us to actually improve these models so that they don't create that kind of output. We restrict the output that these models produce, and so we're actually able to correct for this problem. And here's the thing, yeah, I gotta give it to them. To some extent, they've certainly worked on this. They have business interests to do so. They have worked on this, and the models tend to, or they're doing much better these days anyway, to avoid these kinds of problems. But here's the thing, that has not fixed the underlying deeper problem, because that problem has to do not so much with what the output is, but rather with the structure of knowledge making itself. And in order to understand that, what we're gonna need is we're gonna need about 2 minutes of queer theory in order to understand that problem. So let's go ahead and dive into 2 minutes of queer theory. So queer theory tells us that concepts of knowledge, for example, concepts like gender and sexuality, are not pre-given or natural, but rather that they are formed through humans repeatedly performing certain kinds of behavior, most often unconsciously, so that these behaviors congeal into patterns that we associate with particular contexts, like gender. So this theory is called the theory of performativity. It's most famously associated with the philosopher Judith Butler, but it actually goes back way, way further into the 50s to language theorists J.L. Austin and John Searle, who argued that language paradoxically does not only describe the world, but it in fact creates the world. Now, what does that mean? Essentially what it means that the concepts that we use to make sense of the world, and again we can use gender as an example, they're not just free floating out there, but rather they come into being by humans repeating the same kind of language scripts, the same kind of patterns in language over and over again when they use to describe those concepts or when they use those concepts to talk about the world. Let's use an example here. So for example, think about the notion of gender, think about the notion that is relatively common, I would say, that men are more assertive than women, which I think is somewhat common today. But if you could explain that notion using this theory, by noticing that historically, in those domains of social life where assertive behavior and assertive language was required, for example, politics or law, these domains of life were typically only open to men. So what that meant is that certain groups of people, men, were both allowed and also required to perform in these ways, right? So over time, other groups were not allowed to do this. So over time, essentially, these ideas solidified around the concept of male gender, even though that does not have to be the only possible way of being. And my point is not who is being harmed by this, because arguably everybody is being harmed by it, but my point is that the theory of performativity tells us that these concepts are not natural or pre-given. They have arisen through the repeated use of language. And you can notice that this concept was so entrenched by the time that the women's suffrage movement came along that many people opposed that movement by arguing, well, women are fundamentally incapable of any kind of assertive behavior or language, even thinking, right? If that notion sounds foreign to us today, then that is only because certain people decided to actively intervene in those scripts of language and of behavior. But what has this got to do with AI? Well, if you think back to the schema that I drew up earlier about data, patterns, and new output, And you also think about the fact that data, per definition, comes from the past because we're not able to collect data from the future. And also from right this moment, we are able to collect data, but we can only analyze it by the time it has become the past. Well, if you think about that, the data is from the past, and AI essentially takes that data and identifies patterns, and you put that together with the notion of scripts, well, then you recognize that what is AI going to discover? It's going to discover those scripts from the past, those scripts that we have been fighting against, that we have been trying to push back against. So essentially, AI is only ever going to give us those same old scripts. AI cannot modify those scripts because the recognition of patterns, that is what AI is. So this is a structural thing. This is the structure of knowledge making that AI is built on. So to put this in other words that are maybe a little bit more colloquial, AI is basically when you have history without innovation. Let that sink in. AI is basically, if we had had AI throughout history, we would never have had women's vote. We would never have been able to conceive of marriage as between anyone else than a man and a woman. Inconceivable. That did not happen in the data. We would never have invented a neutral pronoun, they, and that would never have come into use. So basically, what tech developers will rush to tell you, well, not so much the developers, more the companies, is that, but this is a data problem. It's not a structural problem, it's a data problem. And to some extent, you would argue that that's right, because obviously the data is full of these harmful patterns, right? But here's the thing, there's actually nothing wrong with the data, if you think about it. The data, which is truly very harmful, it has a lot of racism in it, as our previous speaker suggested. It has a lot of homophobia, transphobia, ableism, ageism, and so on. But that data does what data typically is supposed to do, which is it reflects the world. And the world is a homophobic, a racist, a transphobic, an ableist place. The data does what data can do per definition, reflect the world from the past, right? The problem is not with the data. The problem is with wanting to use data, which is per definition from the past, in order to freeze those conceptions for the present and the future. That is the problem. AI is never going to do anything different. All it can do is take those scripts, those patterns, recombine them, and spit them back to us. That looks new, but it isn't new. So, in other words, AI is a fundamentally conservative technology. It's actually misleading to call it generative AI when you think about it. It's not generative of anything, certainly nothing new. It's conservative. So for AI, the way things are, or have been, is the only way they can be now, and the only way they can ever be. So if we want to change the world, if we want to end oppressions and push back on stereotypes, we have to come up with something different. So what can we do? Meaning, what can you and I do right now? Well, I think we can do at least 4 things. Let me just give you a couple of options here. So the first thing that I think we should do is we have to understand how AI produces knowledge, and that's what we're engaged in right now, right? We're having this conversation, because that understanding is the first step toward not letting AI have so much power over the way that we conceptualize things. Just remembering how it builds its knowledge. The second thing that we can do, and I think we must do, is push back against the hype of AI. Remember, AI is a fundamentally conservative technology. So those people that are hyping up AI are either unaware of, or worse, happy with the unjust way of the world, the unjust structures, the unjust conceptualizations that are still in place in the world. So that's the reason that we have to push back against that hype. That doesn't mean that AI isn't good for anything. It's good for a lot of things, but it's not good for human concepts. Third thing that we have to do, I think, and we can do, is we have to introduce uncertainty into AI. When we recognize that AI's knowledges serve particular conservative purposes, these knowledges are not the only way for the world to be, we have to find a way to signal that. AI does not have a monopoly over the truth. And finally, which I think is the most important point, we have to prioritize human creativity. Justice and progress come from humans coming up with radically new ideas, imagining radically new things that nobody has come up with before, new things that are transformative. And as we have just seen, AI cannot do this. So our future and the way that we want the world to look like is up to us. So at the end of the day, we gotta let humans play around and be creative. So thank you very much for your attention. I look forward to your thoughts.